Hello dear fellow time traveler of knowledge. Step into the Artificial History channel as we unravel the mysteries of the past and shed light on our world today.
And in today's video we are going to talk about
Unveiling the Magnificence of the Maya Civilization, Decoding the Secrets of an Ancient Mesoamerican Empire. Embark on a captivating journey to the heart of the ancient Maya civilization, one of the most awe-inspiring and sophisticated civilizations in Mesoamerican history. Spanning over 3,000 years, the Maya civilization thrived in the tropical landscapes of present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. In this featured article, we delve into the captivating history of the Maya, exploring their monumental architecture, advanced knowledge of astronomy, intricate hieroglyphic writing, and enigmatic cultural practices. The Maya civilization emerged around 2000 BCE and reached its peak between 250 and 900 CE. Known for their remarkable achievements in art, architecture, mathematics, and astronomy, the Maya left an indelible mark on the cultural tapestry of the Americas. From the towering pyramids of Tikal and Chichen Itza to the elaborate murals of Bonampak, the remnants of their grandeur stand as a testament to their intellectual and artistic prowess. Cities such as Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Uxmal served as vibrant urban centers, bustling with economic activity, political power, and cultural innovation. The Maya mastered urban planning, constructing elaborate ceremonial complexes, ball courts, and residential areas. Their architectural marvels, adorned with intricate carvings and ornate stucco reliefs, showcased their reverence for the natural world and their belief in the divine. Astronomy played a central role in Maya society. They developed a complex and accurate calendar system that meticulously tracked celestial movements. The Mayas' astronomical knowledge allowed them to align their buildings and pyramids with celestial events, creating breathtaking phenomena such as the snake shadow on the Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza during the equinoxes. Their understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and the concept of zero far surpassed their contemporaries. The Mayas' hieroglyphic writing system, known as Maya script, is a remarkable achievement in itself. With over 800 hieroglyphs, the Maya recorded their history, mythology, and rituals on stelae, codices, and stone monuments. Deciphering the intricate glyphs has unlocked valuable insights into their cultural practices, dynastic histories, and religious beliefs, although much of the script remains yet to be fully understood. Trade and commerce were vital components of Maya society. They engaged in extensive long-distance trade networks, exchanging valuable goods such as jade, obsidian, cacao, feathers, and textiles. The Mayas' mastery of agriculture, including the cultivation of maize, beans, squash, and other crops, sustained their population and supported their complex societal structure. Despite their remarkable achievements, the Maya civilization experienced periods of transition and decline. By the 10th century CE, many of their great cities were abandoned, and the civilization gradually faded from prominence. The reasons for this decline, whether environmental, social, or political, continue to be a subject of scholarly debate. The Maya civilization's rich cultural heritage endures to this day, as indigenous Maya communities preserve their ancestral traditions, languages, and craftsmanship. UNESCO has recognized the outstanding universal value of Maya sites such as Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul, ensuring their protection and fostering a deeper understanding of this extraordinary civilization. Step into the world of the ancient Maya, where mathematical precision met artistic expression, and where a profound connection with the cosmos guided their every endeavor. Explore their magnificent cities, decipher their hieroglyphs, and immerse yourself in the profound wisdom and cultural richness of the Maya civilization. That's it, and that's all.
Thank you, dear fellow time traveler of knowledge, for watching this video. Now please hit the like button and subscribe to this artificial history channel to receive more videos like this one.
By doing this, you give me 1 cent of your attention. Thank you and have a nice day.